Welcome everybody to another exciting episode of Under the Dome. I'm your host, Allen Ulrich. Bob is actually here, but we're having audio trouble, so he turned his camera off so you don't see a giant ear next to the screen the whole time. So how are you doing tonight, Bob?
Hey, Alan, I'm doing all right. It's been a long day, so folks, you should probably be happy my camera isn't turned on because I look like death warmed over. But otherwise, we're still kicking out here.
Good deal. All right. Because Bob has been with his son all day today, his son had to have some oral surgery. So if you don't mind me saying that.
Not at all.
Yeah. So he's kind of out of it because I know what it's like to have to spend time in the hospital with one of your own kids. It's very stressful. And it's a very long day. So we're going to try and have a short show tonight. Bob, let's talk a little bit about the Saints' latest signing, Bryan Edwards. Now, he was with the Falcons last year, but because the Falcons were a train wreck at quarterback, and you think our team was bad. His stats, I think he had like 3 catches for 15 yards with the Falcons. But when he was with Derek Carr over there at Oakland, or with the Raiders, I should say, he was a pretty good, solid physical receiver. So kind of give a thumbnail sketch of him.
Yeah, he was, Alan, and I think that this is a nice underrated signing for this team. Bryan Edwards, he's a physical guy. He's 6'3", goes about 212, 215, does his best work in the middle of the field. He's not going to scare defenses over the top, but that's not why the Saints need him. That's not why the Saints were interested in him. He was a 3rd-round draft pick back in 2020 out of South Carolina. But for you draft gurus, you probably remember that there were even some mock drafts that had Edwards going late in the 1st round. Most teams, or most mock drafts, had him going in the 2nd round. So he's that kind of talent. He was very productive at South Carolina. Like you said, he played 2 years with Derek Carr in Oakland. So there's some more familiar faces, getting linked up in New Orleans. Edwards dealt with an ankle injury as a rookie, so didn't get much production. Got 30-something passes, for pretty solid complimentary production for Derek Carr and the Raiders back in 2021. And he's going to be expected to do that kind of to serve that kind of role in New Orleans. The team has Chris Olave, a budding star. If he continues to develop, the surprise breakout season from Rashid Shaheed, but neither of those guys can do what Michael Thomas does. And that's work the middle of the field, dominate those intermediate routes, and just be kind of a go-to 3rd down, move the chains kind of guy for Derek Carr. Now, I'm not saying Bryan Edwards is going to be Michael Thomas, far from it. But as a 4th receiver, if Thomas gets a little bit dinged up or defenses manage to contain him, Edwards will give Carr another target to work the middle of the field. That's why I think this is a key signing. It's an upgrade over Marquez Callaway, who served in that role the last couple years. It's an upgrade over Traquan Smith, and I'm not going to rehash the perpetual disappointment that is Traquan Smith. It's just Bryan Edwards is going to be an upgrade over either of those 2 guys in that spot.
And I think he's going to be an upgrade over Jarvis Landry, who, looks like he's at the end of his career. He had a hard time staying healthy last year. We brought him in as insurance last year in case Michael Thomas was slow to recover, and he ended up getting hurt. So I don't have any problem bringing in more bodies, more physical receivers. And I think they can still look for a receiver in the draft.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they could. And it could be as early as day 2. Some people do not be surprised, folks, that if a physical receiver, such as a Quentin Johnson or a Jackson Smith, the kid from Ohio State, one of those 2 guys slipped to number 29, the Saints would honestly give heavy consideration to taking them. Now, you'll see other mock drafts. I've seen plenty of mock drafts have the Saints selecting a Zay Flowers, or say a Jordan Addison slips down. And I love Jordan Addison, don't get me wrong. Saints aren't going to take either one of those guys. Why? Because they already have a better version of them in Chris Olave. They need a physical guy. That's what kind of receiver Quentin Johnson could be. It's what kind of receiver Jackson could be from Ohio State. I like guys like Xavier Hutchinson from Iowa State in the second or third round. A guy like Cedric Tillman is going to be that big physical guy. So yeah, I agree with you, Alan. Do not be shocked at all if the Saints look to bring in a physical receiver, perhaps fairly early in the draft, because besides Michael Thomas's injury history, he's also not under contract after this year. Bryan Edwards, as good a signing as we think it could be, he hasn't had that kind of production to make you think that he could be a starting receiver yet. So, the Saints got to hedge their bets here, and it's obvious that not only they were interested in Derek Carr, but they intend to actually give Carr an offense to be successful in.
Yeah, I think I saw at the end of last season that the Saints really made no fundamental changes to the offense. They did not release Pete Carmichael and bring in another, or at least go through other offensive coordinators, the interview process and so forth. They definitely took the attitude that the problems this offense had lie in personnel, not with coaching. And we'll see if this works out. I mean, it's that obvious that they are turning over this roster, and I expect a lot more in this draft. One of the receivers, I think you mentioned him, but we have to go back and look at the old standbys of Ohio State, the Ohio State Saints or the New Orleans Buckeyes. Jackson Smith, and I cannot pronounce this man's name, not without sounding like something politically incorrect. Is the N silent in the Ohio State receiver? It's NJ.
I truly don't know.
Okay, so I'm not going to pronounce this because I will butcher it horribly. And my guy does not. I have my draft guide, by the way. I still buy magazines. I know that's weird, but in today's world, I still buy NFL draft magazines.
Oh yeah, so do I.
I like having these things on hand. Plus, it's always fun to go back, 5 years later, 7 years later, look at it and go, oh yeah, they were right on target with this, or oh no, they were way off. But let's just call him Jackson Smith. He's 6 foot, so 6'1", 200 pounds, 4.4 speed. He's compared to Greg Jennings. So you're not looking at a really physical receiver, but the Saints did meet with him. So he is an Ohio State Buckeye. So they have an interest in him. Could you see the Saints going after someone like him, or is he more or less another Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed kind of receiver, and not somebody they're really looking at?
Now, I could see the Saints going after him if he slips to 29. He has the skill set to be even the first receiver off the board, and could go anywhere as early as 12 to 15. If he goes in that range, I don't think the Saints have enough interest to move up to get him. But if he falls close to 29, or certainly is on the board when New Orleans selects, I think he's very much in the equation. Not only because he is an Ohio State Buckeye, and the Saints know that pipeline very, very well, but even though, like you said, and I think the NFL.com comparison of Greg Jennings to Jackson Smith, I think is pretty accurate, because those of you that remember Greg Jennings, he was a very smooth wideout. He looked tall because he was very lanky. And that's the kind of frame that Jackson Smith has. So I'd like to see him add some muscle, some bulk. He has the frame to do that. And he works well in traffic. So he's not the kind of guy. He's not the kind of guy that just because of his build, you're not going to send him over the middle or through the intermediate zones. I think he works well through there. He's a solid route runner. The thing that concerns me about him, he really only had 1 year of good production. Now, and I'll take that back. It wasn't good production. It was fantastic production. 2 years ago, even on an Ohio State team that had Garrett Wilson and that had Chris Olave, Jackson Smith was the leading receiver, and it was by a wide margin. And he had some fantastic games, including a record-breaking performance in the Rose Bowl. So everybody expected him to have this wonderful season, if possible, even a Heisman Trophy candidate. You were hearing him in some circles coming into 2022. He played 3 games because of a hamstring injury. And 2 years before that, his first year with the Buckeyes, he was also limited by injury. So that has to be a little bit concerning, especially with the issues that the Saints have dealt with at wide receiver the last couple of years. But if I tell you what, if he's on that board, I think he's good enough through the intermediate zones. Again, he's not a physical specimen like Michael Thomas is, but he'd work well enough through the intermediate areas to produce very well in New Orleans offense.
Yeah, and that's my thing. I think that there's going to be a turnover in this roster next year as well, and I think this draft is part of that process of turning over. Unfortunately, from the 2016 and 2017 classes, but going to turn over these players and move on from these players that are getting older or starting to become injury prone or breaking down. So Michael Thomas. To an extent, Alvin Kamara, because we don't know how this if he gets this turns out. Is he a declining player, or is he just going to bounce back when there's more weapons around him? The point is, I think the Saints, like you said, will be hedging their bets, and starting to bring in younger players, sort of clear the cap of a lot of these bigger contracts and so forth. So is there a guy or a position that you think the Saints still need to address in free agency before they really turn their focus to the draft?
In free agency, I don't know. I can't see it because tight end would be the first to mind. And you know that I love Juwan Johnson, but I think I'd like to see New Orleans bring in another physical prototype tight end. They had their opportunities to do it in free agency. I mean, there were several names that were available, and all of them came off of the market at very reasonable contracts. And the Saints just sat there and watched them all go. Now, I'm not going to be one of those guys that are pounding my fist on the table saying they didn't do enough in free agency, because I think they've had a wonderful free agency period. It's just not at tight end. Now, I know they looked at Foster Moreau before Foster's medical difficulties, and our prayers and thoughts are certainly with Moreau. But that also tells me that maybe the Saints are interested in a tight end, but it's not going to happen in free agency. Now, there are 2 names that I wouldn't mind seeing them bring in. Max Williams, a former high draft pick that's been absolutely bombarded with injuries, and our old friend from Tampa Bay, Cameron Brate. Now, Brate's slowed down and be 31, 32 years old, I think, but he could still be a solid complement to Juwan Johnson. So if the Saints are going to address anything in free agency, you might see something like that. There are still some defensive tackles out there. I know a lot of people want to see them bring in Yannick Ngakoue or Frank Clark along the edge. Listen, I think even at this stage in free agency, those guys are going to cost too much money. If either of those guys end up in a New Orleans uniform, it's because they're still unsigned after the draft. Kind of a Jarvis Landry situation that we saw a year ago. Wide receiver, those of you that are holding out for OBJ, ain't going to happen. And there's really no other significant wide receivers out there. And it's the same with every other position. Like I said, the position that stands out to me that there are still some legitimate contributors out there are defensive line, both tackle and edge. Linebacker. Maybe you see him bring in a Quan Alexander to bolster that depth if a guy like Quan is willing to play a depth or complementary role, because he's not going to take snaps from Pete Werner, certainly not going to take them from Demario Davis. And the Saints, as much as I love DeMarco Jackson, he's still unproven. So I'd like to see New Orleans bolster the depth a little bit there. We know that Quan knows the defense. We know he has a great relationship with Demario Davis. So with me, Alan, it's not so much positions that I'd like to see them address, but specific names to watch to see if they're still available or unsigned as we approach the draft.
Yeah, it seemed like Foster Moreau was their main target as a tight end, and he was more of that blocking who can go out there and receive, catch receptions, tight end. So that kind of tips their hand what they're looking for in a tight end if they go in that direction in the draft, which I think they will. So that opens up the door for a guy like the Georgia tight end, Washington, I believe his name is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a guy like him, obviously the Notre Dame tight end, Michael Myers, or Michael Mayer. Sorry, not Michael Myers, Michael Mayer. Someone who's a physical tight end, but can also run pass routes. Not the traditional Sean Payton kind of tight end that can line up outside the numbers and run routes like a receiver. I think they were looking more like they want somebody who's a blocker first, can catch passes in the red zone second. Is that how you see this?
Yeah, that is how I see it. And I don't think it'll be in the first round. For a couple reasons. Number one, most of the NFL is going for the bulked up receiving tight ends. That's why Dalton Kincaid from UCLA or from Utah is going to be the first guy off the board in that position. And I love Kincaid, but like you said, I think Dennis Allen is looking for a more physical inline kind of guy. The kind of guy that, yes, he could be a receiving threat, but he's going to be able to be a solid blocker too. The reality is you don't see, outside from Kyle Pitts 2 years ago, you don't see major production from rookie tight ends. You don't. And I'm not going to bore you folks. I'm going to do an article in the next few days whenever the rest of my life settles down. I'm going to do an article that kind of points to the fact that rookie tight ends just typically don't do well in their first year. And without me running down the specific stats, look it up. Travis Kelce, George Kittle, even reaching back, Tony Gonzalez, Antonio Gates, Hall of Fame type players, Rob Gronkowski, none of them wowed you in their first year. And Dennis Allen, I don't care what people say, Dennis Allen's fighting for his job. He needs a successful season. To have a successful season, he needs a successful draft. He needs guys that are going to contribute, high draft picks that are going to contribute right now. So if you are looking for a tight end, I agree with you, Alan. I think the Saints are going to select a tight end. But for those reasons I just mentioned, and for slightly bigger needs on the roster still, I don't think it'll be in the first round. You could see a guy like Sam Laporta from Iowa, who always has a deep pipeline of tight ends in the league. Maybe a Luke Musgrave from Oregon State, one of those guys slip. Darnell Washington in day 2, I think, is a legitimate possibility. The kid, I think I'm saying his name right, Schoonmaker from Michigan. Yeah. Josh Weil is a kid I really love from the University of Cincinnati. Cameron Latu from Alabama is a good physical specimen. It's guys like that you might see the Saints target midway through day 2 or early into day 3. But I agree with you. I think they're going to come out of this draft with a tight end.
Yeah, and like I said, he's looking for that extra blocker more than he's looking for a pass catcher. His pass catcher will be Juwan Johnson, but he's looking for a guy who's going to be a matchup problem inside because this is going to be a run-first offense. And I think people need to realize that too, that this offense is not going to be pass first, then run as it was under Sean Payton. I think Allen, given his conservative nature, at least so far, He's a defensive-minded coach. I think it's going to be very reminiscent of a Jim Moore, Bum Phillips kind of offense, not to that level, not to any, he knows that the game has changed since those guys were coaching. But those guys believed in a strong defense, great special teams, and an offense that runs the ball, controls the time of possession. You have a short passing game. You take shots down the field where appropriate, but you're building it on a running game. And he wants to have multiple running backs that can attack a defense, open things up for his receiver. So he's going to want to play with a big physical tight end who can seal that edge, help those tackles out, and get those runners to the outside. So that's why I'm just, when Sean Payton was here, after a while, I started figuring out the kind of players he would like. And you and I made jokes about it in the past. Go ahead and look up the guy who went to a Division III school. You have to scramble, Google their name, and they get picked in the 3rd round. And you've never even heard of this college before. And it's going to be a guy that's going to be a Sean Payton pick. I think with this staff, this front office, this head coach, it's going to be much more traditional kind of draft, much more from big power schools, and much more of a physical team that is built to win outdoors, built to win in the weather, built to win on the road. So that's just my philosophy. That's just looking at how this team has been constructed so far by Dennis Allen. I mean, do you think that's a fair comparison?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. And you just look at the personnel moves that they made since Dennis Allen has become head coach. They moved up in the draft, or picked up an extra first-round pick in the draft last year to draft a monstrous tackle in Trevor Penning. They drafted a big physical defensive back in Alontae Taylor. Free agency, they went out and got 2 big-bodied athletes, a defensive tackle, Saunders and Shepard. They got a couple of bruisers at safety when they brought in, Abram and Umagi. Am I saying his name right? So they're bringing in those guys. He brings in a running back. I don't think they're done there. I think they draft another running back too. So it's just, you could see that in the personnel moves that Dennis Allen is making. Big physical athletes, and I think that's the direction that both sides of the ball wants to play this year.
Yeah, and Jimmy Gumbo says, pull up Kenny Stabler talking about Bum Phillips' offensive scheme after he left the Saints. I lived it, so I know. Right. I don't want to scare y'all by saying we're going back to Carl Smith and Bum Phillips type of offense, but I just meant in terms of philosophies where, they want to win with defense. They want to win with special teams. It'll be closer games. It won't be 40-10 kind of games that we got used to seeing with Sean Payton, unfortunately. That doesn't mean that the offense is going to be explosive, because the rules today necessitate that. They're still going to run the West Coast concepts, the Aero Coryell concepts that Sean Payton has installed in this offense, because you still have Pete Carmichael calling these plays. It's just, I think they were looking for certain kind of players that Payton may have passed on in the past, because Payton wanted to find those speed guys, those guys that could kind of play his stretch game, his matchup game that he liked so much. Real quick, so you mentioned a little bit about Foster. This is the 3rd player that the Saints medical staff has diagnosed with a serious health condition, going back to Nick Fairley with his heart ailments. You had that magician who was the long snapper they got from the Eagles. They realized he had a heart condition, if I remember right. And now Foster Moreau has this uh, version, I guess, of leukemia. It's a blood cancer, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
So, you know, we knock on Saints social media, especially Saints Twitter, because of the injuries this team has had for the past 4 years. People really knock this medical staff, but it doesn't seem like this. The medical staff is doing these physicals and finding these things. So obviously the staff is competent enough to find serious health problems. So this could be a topic for another time, but what do you think then is the reason for all these injuries? Because I don't think it's the medical staff misdiagnosing things. Is it just bad luck? Is it the field? What could it be?
It's and you know this. It's a combination of everything. But I think the least amount of blame should go to the medical staff. But you're right. That's where they get the most amount of blame in fan circles and on social media.
Yeah,
these guys potentially saved 3 lives. So I think kudos goes to them for that. As far as injuries go, A, that happens. B, it's been because of a lot of bad luck. And let's take the Michael Thomas situation, for example. Remember that Michael Thomas has been going to outside medical people in his own circles to perform their tests, to do their surgeries. It's not done through the Saints medical staff. And inwardly, I'd point the finger more at the strength and conditioning staff than I would the medical staff. Now, I'm not sitting here saying it's all their fault either, but if I was internally, if I was Gail Benson, if I was Mickey Loomis, and if I was the Saints front office and management staff, that's where I'd be looking and really sitting down those guys to question. And if you recall, I know you do, but if you recall, folks, the Saints replaced most of their strength and conditioning staff last year. And as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day. So we'll see if things turn around this year. Because what's killed the Saints are not the injuries themselves. It's that the injuries are so long lasting. And you look at Marshawn Lattimore, for instance. People don't realize that was a potentially life-threatening injury for Lattimore too. So what was described on the injury report as, I believe it was a rib injury, it was a hell of a lot more serious than that. So it's also a matter of coaches just being kind of sweeping stuff under the rug as far as the seriousness of situations, because they don't want you to know that a Marshawn Lattimore is not going to be available for 10 weeks or whatever it turned out to be. But as far as in-house, I'd look at the strength and conditioning staff before I would the medical staff.
Yeah, and a lot of people were just saying, like when you talk about Lattimore's injury, why don't you just put him on injured reserve? It's one of those injuries too that it could be better in 2 weeks. It may be better in 8 weeks. It's a day-to-day kind of injury. So you don't want to lock these guys up for an extended period of time that you can't. They're well enough to play, but they can't play.
Not only that, but you only have X amount of players, of moves that you're allowed to put, where you're allowed to put a player on injured reserve and designate them for return. That's not unlimited. I don't remember what the number is off the top of my head, but you don't want to use up that well early in the season. With players that may or may not return, or like you said, may only miss a couple of weeks. And before you know it, when you have an Alvin Kamara, get nicked up with an injury that he could be back in 4 weeks at midseason, you're out of those moves where you can designate him to return. So if you place him on IR, you lose him for the year.
Exactly. So you're kind of, these are injuries that are unusual for NFL players, because they're, turf toe, a dislocated toe, a kidney laceration, a broken back, but injuries that that a player theoretically can play through some of them. It just depends on his tolerance of pain. And I think Michael Thomas is just one of those guys that doesn't believe in surgery. He's going to try and rehab that injury as best he can to avoid going under the knife. And it's just that maybe just his mindset. And there's some other players who are like, oh, I got a dislocated finger, we're going to surgery, fix that, and we kind of get used to that. So it's a mindset that you have to deal with as well. So I feel that way too. And as far as the turf is concerned, I do think the Saints turf has some issues. I think it's very slick compared to some of the other fields. But, over in Levi Stadium in San Francisco, you've had more players injured on that field, and that's a natural grass field, than any other stadium in the NFL. So, all the talk about, we should go to grass. And then we think about the Super Bowl. Arizona has a field that it's a natural grass field that they keep outside the stadium to grow, and they water it and stuff. And then they use a bunch of specialized carts to wheel this thing back in and put it in there as a playing surface. How many guys did you see slip and fall during the Super Bowl this past year?
Exactly. I mean, it was a nightmare scenario.
Yeah. So, I think the fields can be better, but I think you can't avoid injuries on a field regardless of the surfaces. I know grass is better. Hell, I was on that Superdome turf when it was AstroTurf. And that was like, that stuff felt like what you used to see in front of your door as a doormat in front of your front door. And it was about that thin too. This stuff they're playing on is light years better, but it's still got its issues. And you're dealing with faster players playing with lighter pads, colliding into each other with even greater mass and greater force than they did 30 and 40 years ago. So those joint injuries and bone injuries are going to be much higher.
Yeah, exactly. Alan, folks, I apologize. I'm on my last legs here. So I apologize. I have to call it a night.
I was watching the clock, so believe me, I know. All right, Bob, real quick before you run out of here, what do you have going on for the Bayou Blitz tomorrow?
Brandon and I are hoping to do a little bit what you and I started to tonight. Get a little bit more into draft coverage. Obviously, the Saints, if they make any moves during the day tomorrow, that dictates that. But we're sitting literally a month away from the draft, so it's time for Under the Dome, Bayou Blitz, all the other shows that you watch, follow, all the articles that you read. It's time for us to get into draft coverage. So we're hoping to be able to do that a little bit more extensively than what we have. So that's what we got our eye on.
Good deal. Well, Bob, take care of that kid of yours. We're all pulling for Will. I know it's just a little thing, but any kind of surgery is never good surgery when you're dealing with your kids. So take care, Will. Take care of yourself, and I'll catch you next week.
Will do, my friend. Thank you. And folks, we'll see you soon. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Real quick. So I'm only going to carry this show by myself just for a little bit. I'd asked Bob about the draft. There's some players I think you guys need to watch for, and I would not be surprised to see defensive end be a top priority. I wanted to ask Bob about this. You had Peyton Turner interviewed this past week in the media. He was talking about some of his disappointments, the injuries he's been dealing with. It's a big year for Peyton Turner, but just like Michael Thomas and Andres Pete, it's guys that we really can't rely on to carry this team, you're going to have to hedge your bets. So I expect them to take a pass rusher probably in the first round, probably 29, with a tight end probably coming in the second round. So I just kind of want to get you guys' thoughts on what pass rushers you like best in the draft, if you have any. One of the guys I think we should watch for, I don't think it'll be at 29, but I do think that he is on the Saints' radar. Maybe, if depending on how the draft falls, Andre Carter II. He is out of Army. He is a 6'6", 255-pound defensive end. Now, he played a stand-up defensive end over at Army, so it sounds like he would be more of a linebacker in a 3-4. But that is the same kind of position that Marcus Davenport played, although Davenport was a heavier player, probably a good 30 pounds heavier. But he fits what Dennis Allen likes, a big, tall player with long arms, a fast, good bend, edge player that I could see them looking to play as an outside defensive end, especially as a pass rush specialist early in the draft, maybe in the second round, if they take a defensive tackle or a great tight end falls in the first round. One of the things I think we should look for in the draft is how many quarterbacks go in the first, say, 20 picks or the first 15 picks. You might want to see 5 potential quarterbacks going in that first round, and I'm talking about as far as C.J. Stroud, Young from Alabama, Anthony Richardson out of Florida, Revis out of Kentucky, and possibly Hendon Hooker, all coming out off the board in the first round. That's a good thing for the Saints. I know a lot of people in the beginning had Hendon Hooker going to the Saints in the second round, but I think the longer this Aaron Rodgers drama plays out and the more these kind of things happen with teams, Lamar Jackson, not interested in Lamar Jackson, more interested in possibly drafting their starter of the future. 5 quarterback first round is a good thing for the Saints. Yeah, I do too. The interior lineman from Baylor, I do like him as well. He is a big guy, and there's a lot of big guys in this draft. It's somebody to watch for. A big defensive tackle out of Clemson. That's why I said the more quarterbacks go in this draft, the more talented players in areas of need that the Saints are interested in will slide down to 29, because the last thing I really don't want to see is the Saints trading up to go get somebody. I want them to kind of save some of these assets instead of burning them off to move up to get in the first round, so you only have 4 or 5 picks. I think this team needs to take advantage of as many picks as they possibly can get. The other position that I think the Saints are looking at hard is offensive linemen, guys that can play tackle and guard. They did sign that kid Storm Norton, I believe, from Los Angeles Chargers. But I think they're looking for a guard tackle position, or maybe a center guard position, somebody who can eventually replace Andres Pete. Pete will be a free agent after next year, just like Michael Thomas. They restructured his deal, so he's basically on a 1-year deal, which is a good thing, because I think Pete's not going to stay healthy. Hurst is probably going to be the number 1 guy as the depth guy. Penning seems to be back on track as far as his health. They said he should be ready by training camp. They're just not sure when from his lesser frank injury. So a guy I would look for in the draft. I'm sorry, I got to pull up my draft book because I got to make sure I say these people's names right. But there's a couple guys in the draft I was looking at. Obviously the UL player who went to Florida with Coach Napier, Osiris Torrance from Florida is a guard. he's probably going to get taken early in the draft. So you want to really look at a guy like a Darnell Wright out of Tennessee. He's a guy to watch for, especially if he falls. He's predicted in the third round, but if he falls in the bottom of the third, top of the fourth, that's a guy they could possibly go for. Some of the tackles that they have in the draft that have played probably aren't good enough to play at the tackle level in the pros to watch for. I had a name and I can't find it anymore. I'm sorry. My notes fell out of this book. I apologize. It's probably this one here. I'm usually better prepared than this, but usually I let Bob talk right now while I queue up my other stuff, because this show, we totally fly off the seat of our pants. We go cold. But Bob's usually so well prepared that I can fake it a little bit. But there's a couple of guys to watch. Andrew Voorhees, that was the one I was looking for. The guy out of USC. Somebody else to watch for as a possible guard for the Saints. He's 6'6", 330. My God. Just give you an idea. The Pro Bowl center during the Jim Mora years was, oh my God, I can't believe it. Joel Hilgenberg. I almost said Jay, his brother Jay. Jay finished his career with the Saints. Joel Hilgenberg was 6'1", 265. And this guy is 6'6", 330. It shows you how much the game has changed. But he is a guy that probably would fit in well as a run blocking baller to fit on the left side. That's somebody to watch for. I'll go through a couple other names. And yeah, Jimmy Gumbo, you're right. They still running back depth. I still think they look at running backs. I don't know if the Tulane kid is the guy that we're looking at. I think they like him, but his Cotton Bowl performance is really getting him shooting up the charts. I still think he's a little too small for the Saints. He's more of the old traditional third down guy. He's a guy as you would get out in space, so he would be a good successor to Alvin Kamara, but I just don't think he's got the physical size that Kamara had. So, guys to look for, Zach Charbonnet, of course, is somebody. Gibbs from Alabama, I'm not too sold on. There's a couple other guys I like a little bit better. There's I'm trying to find the name of the guy I saw earlier that I really liked. I apologize. I'm usually better prepared than this, but I'm not prepared to sit here and talk about the draft for myself. I think it was Kenny McIntosh. Not as somebody who would probably be a third down back, somebody who would come in as an alternate. Tank Bigsby from Auburn is somebody to watch for because he's that power inside runner. So, I think if they look at a running back, I think the running back really would be now in the fourth round, just because Bijan Robinson is going to go in the top 10 or top 15. I really think he's the number one target in the draft. He's not going to make it to the first round, to the bottom of the first round. And then the guys that you look in the second and third round, that's when you really want to start targeting your tight end, your pass rusher, your defensive tackle. So you're really looking at first pick in the fourth round, unless they trade some of those fifth round picks to try and so maybe a pick for next year to move back up to the bottom of the third. That'll be the interesting thing to see how this plays out. As far as free agency, I still think the Saints have a couple of moves they're going to make. But the bulk of it's going to be after the draft. I think after this week, free agency is pretty much going to die down because it's going to be all focused on pro days and getting out in the draft and looking at these prospects at their pro days, focusing on putting their boards. That's where they are right now. I asked my son if he could jump in right now, but he has not responded to me. He is the draft guru. That kid, I turned into a monster. He is addicted to the NFL draft, NBA draft as well, but the NFL draft. He's the guy I would go to for a lot of these names that I have to brush up on. So it's going to be a short show tonight. I appreciate all you guys chiming in, you guys coming in to see what's going on. I promise you we'll get a full show next time. Poor Bob, he had texted me earlier in the day saying he was at the hospital with his son Will. This was planned. It's not anything dramatic, but it is. You're talking about a young son, a young kid. So any kind of surgery is scary. It's just some dental oral surgery, but it was a long day for him. So I tried to arrange for my son to jump in. He wasn't able to. So the show's going to end early tonight. I appreciate you guys sticking with us. I promise you next week we'll have a much fuller show. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. We'll see you next week under the dome. Good night, everybody.